the Minister for Innovation, Tourism, Industry Development and Minister for Cross River Rail, and she's also representing the Premier today. So if you like, she's the ultimate multi-skiller. Good morning and welcome to you, Kate.
Unmute me. Good morning, Margie. It's great to be here and great to be with all of the TTF members as well.
Thank you so much. Look, let's get right into it because we have, not a great deal of time for what is probably the most important industry in Queensland and all the other industries that you represent. The Queensland government is doing its best job to protect the health of Queenslanders by keeping those borders closed to other states. How are you actually supporting the local tourism industry through this process in the absence of international and interstate markets? Because it is a crippling and devastating situation, a terrible choice for governments to have to make.
Yeah, Margie, you're absolutely right, and I acknowledge everybody that is part of this forum and indeed all of the industry leaders that have been engaging directly with government since the first phone call I got about the impacts of COVID was actually on the 22nd of January. So this is something that as an industry we have been working together now for many, many months to get right. Margie, I was actually started the week both in the Whitsundays and Yeppoon, and of course people are doing it very tough, particularly the small operators that you've spoken about. As a government, we've had a very strong Unite and Recover plan based in the state that actually complements and works with the relief that the federal government has also been getting out the door to support businesses. In total now, we've now injected more than $6 billion into support and relief and partnering with the private sector across the state. For small operators, of course, this included more than $1 billion worth of loans and grants to help small businesses that are completely lost, in some cases, down to around 10% of the revenue they would ordinarily get through the door. So it has been very tough times. In addition to that, we recognise from a tourism industry, there are a number of levers that we can pull as a government to actually get that stimulus up and running. That's why we've announced more than $50 million in support. This includes, as you know, $15 million to work directly with our airports, and I know a number of them are on the line, and our airlines to get more flights across Queensland and where we strategically can. Was very proud to be there to see the first flights, for example, between the Sunshine Coast and Cairns, something the industry had talked about for a long period of time, and this critical funding support has enabled to occur. In addition to that, we recognise, as a lot of the questions and sentiments that we're seeing today, is that we also need to have an eye on the future. And one of the things industry made very clear to me is they would love to see They wanted to see another round of a very successful growing tourism infrastructure fund. So we announced $25 million to support businesses that during this tough time to invest in the new infrastructure and experiences that when the industry opens up more fully into the future, they have new experiences that they can offer to tourists and to the market. And Margie, I mentioned that because whilst we've got $25 million to partner with the private sector, we saw more than $300 million worth of applications, which says to me that we are doing it very tough right now, and it will take a number of years to get out to the pre-COVID times. But there are also very resilient people in our industry that are thinking about, well, how is it I can change my business to ensure that in the future I do have a product that is what people are looking for.
I mean, I think that's an interesting point too. This is an opportunity. I mean, it is terrible circumstances for everybody in the industry at the moment, virtually, but one of the upsides out of this is the innovation factor and the fact that this is an opportunity to, in fact, create new content and get it right before we actually reopen to the international market.
Absolutely. And I think the other issue for us is how do we, and it's been really interesting because when you talk to Shane O'Reilly, who had been known to many of you here, or Judy Turner, some of that boutique high-end experiences are doing quite well at the moment because that's what people are looking for when we have, we know that around, I think Queenslanders alone normally spend more than $8.6 billion annually in overseas travel. So whilst we are constrained in the current market, where we can work with industry and businesses to, with our Good to Go campaign, for example, where we've seen more than 5 million people have interacted with Good to Go campaign, that we're really trying to push out those experiences that if you haven't done before and have always been on your list of things you'd like to do, now is the time to do that, to support our tourism industry during, as you say, one of its toughest hours.
I mean, I think the other question that automatically springs to mind is once borders are open again, that in itself will create a massive challenge for every state as they try and re-attract people back who are a little nervy about travelling. Mind you, I'm forced to admit that Queensland probably has a natural advantage in terms of getting those visitors back. But do you see that as being a critical issue going forward, and it's going to need more attention from government to get people travelling again?
Oh, absolutely. And I think some in Birmingham would acknowledge that, certainly in the conversations I've had with him as a national minister. That's a challenge for him as a nation. As you say, as a Queensland tourism minister, I can be very parochial on this front. But Margie, I think what it hits home to me is that I feel like, having been in this role now for 5 years, that some of the decisions we've made will actually really help us when we're in the position to be able to reopen. And I mean, look where our Victorian friends are right now. They are in a world of pain as a state, and I think they're going to find it very tough in their reopening. I mentioned the decisions we've made to date because there's a couple of things that come to mind for me. One is, the first thing we did when we came into government was to restore the funding to Tourism Events Queensland. So they've got the 4-year funding guarantee that we have now injected more than $400 million into, to ensure that they can plan for the future. The CEO there, TTF, knows that while we're in government, they will have that 4-year funding guarantee, which means they can actually have that funding and plan for the future, something that industry overwhelmingly told me was a critical first step. So that remains in place. What I think a lot of people on this call might not be aware of is that one of the other things industry told me in the first term is that they'd love to see investment in new experiences and infrastructure to make Queensland more competitive. And trying to look for the silver lining in this cloud, what comes to mind for me is that we've now backed 70 new tourism experiences in Queensland that are either opening up this year or be ready to open up next year, when we actually see, hopefully, more free movement of Australians and ultimately, hopefully, our international tourists back. So they are, for the first time, Spices is an example of it, the work we're doing and the Wengeti Trail, we finally have, and something you and I've talked about for many, many years, Margie, even when I was Environment Minister, is, something I'm very proud of, is we now have glamping on National Park in Queensland. Something that's been spoken about for a decade is now open and operating and seeing record numbers of visitors. So in total, we've got 70 new experiences from the outback. Today, we just announced $1 million towards the underwater art in Townsville for the second stage of that project. So I think that we're going to be in a unique position to market these new experiences that Australians and international tourists have never seen before, which will give us an edge in what you rightly point out will be a very competitive space.
So just moving slightly onto the business events marketplace, and I would like to talk about business travel too, because I think it's a real sleeper issue, restoring the confidence of the corporate community in terms of travelling. I mean, we're Zooming, and I think, we're facing a future where many of these business events are going to be hybrid events into the future. I mean, where do you see the business events industry in terms of your forward strategy, because it is such a critical part of the marketplace?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, for example, at the last election, we did promise to commit an extra $3 million for business events. And we've been very successful in partnering with the 5 convention bureaus to actually grow those events, which kind of in some ways has made it more heartbreaking, Margie, because, we had secured a number of major events to Queensland for the very first time because we were able to leverage more funding. Our government absolutely understands that business travel and business events is critical to growing Queensland's economy, and will continue to provide record investment in business events. We've worked really closely through TEQ and I say the convention bureaus to maintain those relationships. And I think the broader conversation we'll need to have as an industry moving forward is the point you make, Margie, about the fact that, events into the future might not look and feel the same way that we've experienced over the last few years. But investing in critical infrastructure like the Cairns Convention Centre, which is under construction right now, will also give us an edge in being able to provide, what is a world-class experience in a world-class destination. So I think the answer for government has to be that continued investment, and we're certainly not going to walk away from our investment in business events going into the future.
Just as a sort of subset of that too, although I know it's not specifically part of your portfolio, but, I'm channeling Premier here today. From the point of view of
trouble, Margie.
From the perspective of the performing arts and the visual arts, this is a devastating time, and I think Queensland's really carved a major niche in the national market now, being able to bring big shows to Brisbane in particular, and I'm just wondering where you see the possibilities in terms of theatre reopenings and so forth, and where that's going to play, because it is so important in terms of return visitation to capital and other major regional centres.
Yeah, and I think, Maggie, you've really hit a good point, because you talked about the fact that it's going to be a very competitive marketplace. So backing events, backing business events, backing cultural events is going to be the way that we fill planes and we fill airports. And that's certainly the work that we're doing behind the scenes. And Leanne Enoch, my colleague, was one of the first arts ministers. Well, we were the first government actually in Australia to announce a support package for the arts in the very first tranche of our economic Unite and Recovery plan. We've now backed that in further with a further $25 million, because what I would hate to see is something that I've lived through as a Queensland girl, the brain drain and the talent drain that we saw in the 80s and 90s of our best and brightest artists. We've worked really hard to bring them back to Queensland, investing in the expansion and upgrade at the convention centre here and the cultural centre across the border. And we'll continue to make that investment, not only in the infrastructure, but the talent. And one thing that we have invested heavily in, for example, is the Queensland Ballet. And looking once again, I feel like I'm everyone else in the room, like what are the silver linings that we can cling to for hope for the future? And, seeing the new academy, the Ballet School Academy at Kelvin Grove College going up, this brand new state-of-the-art facility will really cement that talent pool. So something that is, not a $50 million project, but something that says very clearly to the market that we are going to continue to invest in the arts.
Mm. Can I I'm just looking at some of the questions that are coming through on our Q&A line. Minister, do you mind if I just move to some of those now?
That's fine.
Well, there's a question here, and it's not surprising because I think it is still the one uppermost in everybody's mind, and it is about the borders. There was an announcement made yesterday that borders are unlikely to open for Christmas. How do we give the tourism industry in particular some certainty about this exercise? I know with the process of the virus, it's a bit of a case of how long's a piece of string, but, there is a need for a different kind of way of managing that engagement with the industry so they've got some sort of certainty.
Yeah, and Margie, I've certainly, and I'm sure there's a number of people that are on this forum that I've spoken to personally or in different fora in the last few months about this, and I understand that. And I think the Premier has, and certainly the Premier's copped this to her, directly to her. I mean, the challenge for us is, everyone thought, for example, that New Zealand was out of the woods, that they did the hard closures, that closed down their economy, that they had actually dealt with the COVID issue, only to have it resurrect itself. And they've had to go now back into large-scale lockdowns. And the other thing industry tells me is that what they don't want to do is reopen, close, because so many businesses, as even Village Roadshow would say, that they can't survive upscaling, then closing and upscaling again. So I think the Premier's comments yesterday are trying to, very similar to what the Prime Minister said at the beginning of this pandemic when he stood up there and told us all, at the very least, this was 6 months. I think the Premier is making it as best you can, and we've listened to the health advice the whole time. There are a number of occasions, I've certainly felt them as the Minister in this portfolio, where it would have been easy to open our borders, and people called for that and under a lot of political pressure to do so. But we've seen what's happened in Victoria. There is no tourism industry in Victoria right now, none, nothing. Their economy, in actual fact, my fear is the impact of the Victorian economy shutdown on the coffers of the national government will actually see all states, including Queensland, impacted with our GST contribution. We've already lost $3 billion in GST revenue to the state, and that's a real problem for, that's just the facts that we have to deal with. So I would love to sit here and say I could provide more certainty, but by the same token, I think if we were providing that misinformation, that doesn't do the industry any good either.
Can I ask you a sort of slightly different question, but back to aviation again, because we're almost out of time, but I do think Queensland is one of the states that's more than any other dependent upon an aviation industry. We're a long-haul destination. Queensland's probably got the most successful aviation attraction fund in the country. You were, first players in that space. Where do you see that going in future? Because it's clearly going to be vital to the aviation industry going forward.
And I think this is where agility is really, really critical. And once again, Margie, I made the decision 2 years before COVID to use aviation attraction funds that would have always been for international to be for domestic, because I could see the benefit, as you rightly point out, that I don't care if someone comes from China or from Melbourne, but if they're going to go to Cairns and Townsville and spend money in that local economy, then that's my job. I also do want to give for lack of a better word, a shout out to the airports and the airlines here in Queensland. They work really well collaboratively together. And I think what I have seen from a TTF perspective as the Minister for Tourism in Queensland is that everyone in this industry has stepped up. They've stepped up together. They've stepped up to collaborate. And where I've often had proposals coming to me from multiple parties saying, we think we can get more flights and more people back into these communities through this package. So, we've announced the $15 million, $10 million of that's already been committed. So we do have and we're in negotiations with some other flights. But Margie, I've said to every airline and every airport, give me your ideas. We will consider them. And absolutely, we are looking forward to continuing to work with those industry partners because you're right, we're the most decentralised state. We need those flights. We need those connections, and we'll continue to invest in them. Now is not the time to wind back funding and support for the tourism industry. And I'm really proud that our government has, delivered record funding to date and will continue to deliver record funding to support an industry that is so critical, not only to jobs in Queensland, but I also think it goes to the heart of the very optimism and identity of who we are as Queenslanders.
Look, Kate, thank you so much for that commentary today. We appreciate you're always a champion for the industry across the board and that these are difficult times. And we know that that borders is kind of the number one issue for everybody who's on this call.
Very aware of that. Very aware of that.
So, look, and we appreciate the fact that you've innovated in this space previously, and we look forward to seeing what's going to be the next iteration of the tourism industry in Queensland. And I think this is a moment of great opportunity for everybody across the board.
Okay, thank you so much, Margie, and thanks to everyone that has really worked together as an industry. I feel really proud to represent an industry as strong as the tourism industry here in Queensland. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. Take care.